let's get started. So today we are talking about rebellion and being a useful rebel, or as Francesco Gino, who wrote the big article on this, describes it, being a constructive nonconformist. So that's the sort of the official term, constructive nonconformist. We just think of it as being a useful rebel. If you might have listened to the podcast, but if you've not, please don't worry, but head into chat and let me know, what do you think are some of the characteristics of a useful rebel? So when you look across an organization and you're thinking, like, what are the things that they do? What behaviors would you observe? Jamie's saying curious, yeah. Emotional intelligence, challenging the status quo, curious and brave, thinking outside the box, challenging but for positive reasons, confident, innovative. I like that, Louise. Act now, apologize later. I got a boss who always used to say, what's that phrase? Ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And she was very big on that. As a director, she was really senior and she just sort of lived her life that way. She was like, no, I think this is probably right. So let's just do it. Unconventional thinking. That's really nice, Julia. I love that framing. Don't be limited by what is, thinking about what could be. That what is versus what could be is really nice framing. I think that would be really helpful for people, because if you have listened to the podcast, you will have heard me grapple a bit with this word rebel. I think when you say rebellion, I think, oh, I'm not very rebellious. I don't think this is me. I'm somebody who doesn't particularly like conflict. But then actually when you start to kind of frame it in these ways, like, oh, imagining what could be rather than just being limited by what is, I think, oh, I'm really good at that. That's something that I could contribute to a team or to an organization in that way. Accepting that the boss always doesn't know best yet. And I think that's a really important, when you look at the case studies, you see lots of examples of leaders who clearly recognize that they don't always know best. So also that self-awareness coming from the top and saying, well, how do we encourage useful rebellion? Because what you see is most people have got very used to conformity. If we think about kind of the staircase or the ladder, however we kind of want to see it, and how we're structured in organizations, certainly for most of us, we have learned to conform. You have learned behaviors by watching other people. It's very structured. It's sort of well, this is the way we do things around here. And there's sometimes not lots of space around the edges for doing things differently. So often it's a bit about, when you're thinking about what you need to unlearn and relearn, sometimes I think we've got to unlearn conformity and then relearn going, okay, well, what does it mean to be a useful rebellion or a constructive nonconformist, whatever you want to call it? But there are three things I think are worth kind of bearing in mind for yourself when you're thinking about this, in terms of how often do you do these things? So the first one is, how often do you challenge the status quo? So how often do you challenge the status quo? And the status quo might be, we've always done it this way. Very much that point about limits and kind of limitations. Just because we did it that way doesn't mean we need to do it that way again. And can you do that in a way that feels useful? So rather than just challenging status quo for the sake of it, which I can think of quite a few people I've worked with who were very good at that, but weren't that helpful at then going, well, what's the so what? So I think if you're going to challenge the status quo, personally, I think you need a so what attached to it. Okay, so what might we try differently? So what could that look like? And so you're not doing it, you're not being deliberately difficult. Actually, you're trying to get to better outcomes. You're trying to get to better answers. So does that feel like you? Do you feel like you do that really well? Or do you feel like maybe that's a gap that you've got? Next one. Do you say what you think? Or do you keep those thoughts to yourself? So do you say what you think? And even if what you think is different to everybody else, that you have a question and you think, well, shall I ask this? Because nobody else seems to be thinking this. And they probably are. It's just that nobody's brave enough to say it. So can you be that person? Can you say what you think? Or if you don't understand, are you prepared to say that? Inevitably, you won't be the only one. Or sometimes I think this can be linked to, I was thinking about this for myself yesterday, this can be linked to your confidence gremlins. So you might not say what you think if your confidence gremlin is getting in your way. So one of my gremlins that I work hard to cage is around numbers. All goes back to the fact I wasn't very good at maths at school. And so sometimes when we're looking at Amazing If and some of our numbers around Amazing If, do I say what I think in a way that where sometimes I might have a different point of view or think, well, this is not helpful? Or does that gremlin stop me being a useful rebel? But maybe I'm a really useful rebel because I'm not brilliant at numbers. Maybe actually I can see the world in a different way and can ask some very different questions. So have you got the confidence to do that? So I was thinking, I wonder if there's a interesting relationship here between your ability to do this generally and how confident you feel. I think if you're not feeling very confident and if you're not feeling supported, very hard to challenge the status quo, very hard to kind of say what you think. And have you figured out how to do this in your sort of your own style? So I'm just going to put own or ownership. So I think, again, sometimes we mistakenly think, oh, this has to be, the person that always speaks up in a meeting. Maybe we sometimes see these as more extrovert behaviors, but I think we've got to figure out kind of what does this look like for us? Because when you really dive into this research, and I'll send the long read, I'll put the link to it at the end of today. One of the things is around feeling like you can show up and sort of be yourself and do this in your own way. That doesn't mean bringing your whole self to work. That's a slightly different thing. And we've talked before about, I don't think we should put pressure on people to bring their whole self to work. What this means is, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I've got a sense of community in my organization in a way where I think we can then rebel in a useful kind of way? So just starting to kind of, I think often breaking down the characteristics of something that can feel quite big and scary is helpful. Quick quiz for you this morning. If you had to guess, what do you think is the number one trait for rebel talent? So what do we think is the number one trait? My clue is it has already come up this morning. Let me know. So if we were thinking about a trait, I would describe this as a skill as well. If I would probably say skill over trait, but what's the thing that makes the most difference? And I think you're all right. There's no wrong answers in PodPlus, is there? But from the research, certainly, the thing they found, the number one trait was curiosity, which I always find really interesting. There's that great quote from Ken Robinson, brilliant TED Talks, if you've never watched Ken's TED Talks. And he's really interested in education systems and how we encourage people to be creative. And he describes curiosity as the engine of achievement. And I often think with organizations, I find it fascinating. Lots of organizations have curiosity or learning as a value. They'll talk about, either values or behaviors. And you see curiosity pop up a fair bit. And I can actually only think of one organization, because we've worked with them, so I know them well enough, where I think, oh, they really live and breathe that. They actually take curiosity really seriously. And when you're thinking about that, you're like, okay, well, if curiosity is going to help us to achieve more, it's also going to help us with this idea of useful rebellion. Because when you get useful rebellion, it means that you're more likely to solve problems in new ways, to spot opportunities to add value, to kind of do things differently. So you move organizations forward. But I think the problem, the relearning thing is actually not to be underestimated. Everybody's got used to doing kind of things in the same way. Love that. Replace judgment with curiosity. Yeah, that's a really nice phrase. So it's just interesting to think about, okay, if we were going to develop this skill, if we were practically going to think about, well, where are we in terms of being able to create an environment or a culture where we can get different points of view, where people can challenge the status quo, where people can feel like they can speak up and to say what they think. Okay, well, we need to help people to be curious. When we're then running workshops and we're talking about learning and curiosity is one of those things that people often see as an addition to the day job. My challenge is always, how do we add it into the day job rather than add it onto the day job? And I think they're very different things, because if you're trying to add it onto the day job, almost I can sense from people, oh, well, the expectation is after work, I need to find time to read a book or listen to a podcast. You're like, who does that? Nobody has that time, because everybody, then you need downtime. We need people to be doing different things outside of their day job to be good at their day job. And so again, it's a bit of reframing in terms of how we see curiosity. And I think sometimes we define it in a too much of a kind of narrow way. And we do go, it has to look like kind of reading a book. Maybe it's more about, well, what does that mean in terms of if you were to add curiosity to your team meetings, what would that look like? If we were being more curious about the questions that we asked, what would that look like? Who do we think are useful rebels? Here are a few people that I came up with, but let me know in chat, who do you think are some useful rebels that you have spotted and seen? So Martin Lewis, great example, Charlotte. Yeah, do you know, I didn't think of Martin Lewis, and yeah, he's a really good example. In case people don't know, so this is Anna Whitehouse, or sometimes known as Mother Pucker on Instagram. So she has done lots of campaigning for flexible working, and she's actually just had a bill passed in the House of Lords. I think the bill is the right for everybody to be able to request flexible working. I don't think it's the right for everybody to have it yet. I think that's kind of the next bit they're going for. But she has campaigned pretty relentlessly on flexible work. Yeah, that is Pregnant and Screwed, Jamie, is Josie. Can't remember Josie's surname, but Josie works with Anna. So they're kind of in a similar area. Oh, that's a good bit of curiosity there from Gabby. So Mary Porter's podcast features lots of mavericks. Yeah, Lauren is a good example. Do you know what, Lauren will probably be, we know Lauren really well. She'll probably be disappointed that I didn't put her on here. This is Sam Conniff. He wrote Be More Pirate. And generally, even though he wrote this book, he has a very kind of rebellious mindset when you spend time with him. He's always challenging the status quo. That's right, Steve Jobs, yeah, Greta Thunberg. This is here, you've probably seen from the logo below. This is Yvonne Chouinard, who is the founder of Patagonia. This book is really worth a read. It's quite an old book now, but I think they've updated it a couple of times. It's just really interesting to read somebody who set a business up in a completely different way. And the reason it's called Let My People Go Surfing, probably relatively obvious, but it was a business that was founded by people who loved the outdoors. So loved climbing, loved surfing. And their point was, well, if the surf is good, that doesn't come along that often. So when the waves are good, we just stop working and go out surfing. And you sort of go, yeah, great. I mean, that sounds brilliant. But, it didn't feel like a nice to do. It felt like the opposite, actually, when you read about them. It's not the ping pong table thing. Oh, we're just going to put in some nice cushions to make everyone feel better and let people play table tennis. It was sort of bedded into their culture because that was their company. They were creating clothing that, should be hard wearing, should be durable. Very interesting from a sustainability perspective as well. There are classic examples. That's probably slightly overused now. But I do think actually reading the book, he's very honest as well about what he got wrong. And they got loads wrong. And they had some really interesting, not necessarily falling outs, but kind of dynamics in terms of running that company. And he's very open about that kind of journey. So just really interesting to have a read. So next question for you all. If we were going to try and encourage more deliberate dissent, let's use that phrase to get us started, what kind of questions could we be asking each other in team meetings, in one-to-ones, just on Teams chats? But what could those questions sound like? Because I wonder, again, if you are really specific about saying, well, here are 3 questions. Here are 3 go-to questions to encourage deliberate dissent. And you might not use that phrase, but essentially we know what we're doing. We're trying to encourage useful rebellion. Like, what would that sound like? Yeah, great one from Steve there. What could go wrong with this? Really like that. The how and the 5 whats. Great, Jamie. Yeah, who, what, why, where, when, and how. Becky, like that. What are we really trying to achieve? Yeah. What could be more progressive? Yeah. Imagine we were now trying to be even more deliberately dissenting. Let's be even more kind of deliberately provocative. Where might we go? Yeah, Louise, love that. Devil's advocate. If you could imagine an outcome without limits. Great example there from Lisa. Love that one. Because what that does is that lets go of constraints, which is always really nice. What's the alternative? Who will hate this, Kate? I like that. That's sort of where I was trying to get to. Almost having fun. Can you be fun and playful with some of this sort of deliberate dissent? If we don't do this, what would we do instead? What's the out of the box perspective? Yeah. So I was actually sometimes thinking, what would ... do? So, if you were somebody maybe in your industry or somebody in your team that you could look to outside of your organization, but that everybody would recognize. So if I think I know Anna Whitehouse's work well enough, I know Anna a little bit. If I was to say, what would Anna do? I'd be like, oh, okay, so Anna has like an activist mindset. She has a campaigning approach. That would get me and our team, as long as you all kind of know that person, you get to a different outcome. She's also very brave in terms of calling things out. So where things are kind of not acceptable, behavior is not acceptable. And actually, she's very willing to then sort of accept the consequences of kind of doing that, of doing the right thing. And she talks a bit about those as well, and how hard it is to do that. So you could have what would a ... person do? That can take you, and that person or company needs to be very different to yours. Otherwise, it doesn't get you to a different kind of point of view. It just gets you to more of the same. You can always do opposites. So we had examples of this. So like, what's the opposite? So yeah, if you were thinking, okay, we're going to do an event for 1,000 people, you might ask yourself, okay, so what's the opposite of that? And it might not be necessarily doing an event for 10 people. It might be, oh, we don't do an event, and actually we write a book instead, or we do something very different. That's why, and we put it on the pod sheet, going back to the why behind the work can really help you. Because actually, if you get to an outcome, oh, it has to be an event for 1,000 people, it can often be quite hard if that's your starting point. Whereas if your starting point is the why, our why is, let's say our why is we want to create a Squiggly careers community. Like going, oh, does that need to be a podcast? Not necessarily. Does that need to be a book? Not necessarily. You get to it removes some of the constraints. Why reminds you kind of the original purpose, which I think can help to be more generative in terms of ideas. I really like, I'm very interested in getting better at this because it's not naturally something I'm great at, but I like it. What data would tell us to do something different? So what data do we have that would suggest a different point of view, a different perspective? Just a quick reminder to go on mute, people, if you don't mind, just got a tiny bit of background noise, but just asking ourselves around data, or sometimes maybe what data do we have that supports us to kind of take this perspective. Steve has just shared 6 hacks. So 6 hacks thinking is really good as well if you've not come across this before. And the idea here is that, and the reason I like this, is it doesn't put you in boxes that goes, oh, well, I'm a blue hat and Steve is a green hat. What it encourages you to do is to wear different hats. So, if you were being kind of worst case scenario hat, okay, where do you get to? If you were being the most optimistic, where would you get to? And so again, maybe just having some profiles. If you just created some profiles, and it just gives permission and makes it a lot easier for people. So you might sort of go, there's a worst case scenario profile. There's a no limits profile. There's, what would I have? I'd probably have like a data profile. So if we were putting our data hats on now, what would the data tell us? I think as well, if you can do this in a way that feels objective and outside of individuals, it makes it much safer. So if you can come up with 3 or 4 questions, if we just said together, what's the worst case scenario? Together we are discussing that, debating that, deliberating, rather than going, well, Sarah, what do you think the worst case scenario is? Which can feel like quite a leap for people if you've been very used to conforming. So maybe just creating some of these questions, ones that everybody gets used to asking each other, and you're making them level-less as well. So it's not about going, oh, well, the most senior person has the answers, albeit I do think it's very powerful when you see senior people role model asking these questions and being prepared to sort of interrogate, what we've always done doesn't need to be kind of what we will always do. So maybe just thinking about, like, what could this look or sound like for you in your role? You can do this obviously for yourself, but you can also think about what this looks like in teams. And then just a couple of other things that I think are helpful. Often when we're thinking about challenging status quo or speaking up or thinking about doing things differently, you're not going to apply that to everything all at once. So I always think there's two areas to spot that I think are often quite helpful. One is, like, what are the frameworks that we already have in place? So what are the things that already exist? So this could be, project meetings, steering groups. If I think back to my Sainsbury's days, you've got working groups, you've got steering groups, you've probably got meetings about the working groups and about the steering groups. I could keep going. So what are the frameworks that are already there? And what does it look like to create challenge and to sort of challenge the status quo within them? So what you're not trying to do as your starting point is go, well, we shouldn't have steering groups or we shouldn't have working groups. What you might do is go, well, what would happen if we structured that working group in a different way? What would happen if we made that working group half the time? I saw, who is it? It's one of the online retailers this week who have put a money value on meetings. Like, if any of you, Shopify, that's what it is. So Shopify have gone, this is how much it costs us for you being in this meeting for half an hour. And they've been deliberately provocative. And so then they're really questioning all their people to go, well, is that worth £7,000? Is that? And actually, when you look at the numbers, you're like, oh, crikey. I mean, if anything is going to focus your mind, I mean, it's not for everybody, and it's a very sort of deliberate tactic, I think, but they want to be anti-meeting. They don't want people to have meetings for meeting's sake. And I think depending on your organization, if I think about the big ones that I was part of, there were quite a lot of meetings for meeting's sake, or too many people in meetings. So I do think that to me is a really good example of useful rebellion, like putting a monetary value on meetings to then sort of go, okay, so well, what does that mean? Do you really need that meeting? How might you do that differently? How could you do that meeting in half the time? You save 50% of the cost. So freedom within frameworks, I think, sounds really interesting. I think the other thing for you to think a little bit about is, and this is probably where I go with rebellion, is frustration. So you've got freedom within a framework, and you've also got frustrations. So what are the things that frustrate you? Because I get quite easily frustrated. I'm like, oh, why does that have to be that way? Or why does that work in that way? Or why are we talking about this again? All of those things. I've naturally got a critical brain, and that also means that I sometimes get frustrated. Frustrations are an excellent source of curiosity and useful rebellion. So maybe rather than, when you spot a frustration, rather than maybe responding with, either going, oh, well, that makes me feel, maybe passive. So I'm just going to get frustrated, but I'm passive and I don't do anything about it. Or rather than maybe just thinking, well, that's still frustrating. Maybe you get blamey, like, well, why has ... not done anything about this? Or why have we not done anything about this? I think frustrations are a really useful source of curiosity. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's frustrating me. Well, what might we do differently? Like, why are we doing this thing? What would it take to do something dramatically different? So yeah, frustrations I always find really interesting. I'm sort of sometimes quite good at spotting and less good at then sort of turning or transforming those things into then something useful. What is helpful is Helen is very good at that. So often we are quite a good team. So the other thing to say on this is not all about you doing this solo, because I do think useful rebellion is hard and tiring. And I've done a fair bit of this in corporate land, where I was sort of slightly more lone wolf, less so now. But if you can surround yourself with a community to support you when you're doing something different, or where you're trying to be more of a kind of useful rebel, it helps you to keep going, helps you to keep growing. This is a really good example of that. So everybody who turns up here on a Thursday morning is because you believe in squiggly careers. Now, squiggly careers might not feel that rebellious, but I can promise you, I remember all the meetings where everyone was like, this is not a good idea. And I remember those conversations where people were like, I'm not sure anyone will ever go for this. I'm not sure organizations will ever work with you on this idea of squiggly careers. And you sort of go, at that time, actually, in hindsight, it felt really rebellious to be talking about careers not as ladders and as squiggles. What kept Helen and I going was Helen and I. And then slowly but surely kind of creating a very small community of people going, oh, actually, we think this is useful. We think this is helpful. What would happen if you let go of the ladder? What would you replace it with? What would we do differently in terms of our careers and our career development? What would happen if we made career development available to everybody, not just the fortunate few, which, you know, in lots of organizations, there is still a sort of ladder-like approach to learning. Yeah, well, now, Jennifer, thank you. I'm really glad we did too. I mean, I can't take loads of credit for going, oh, it felt so difficult. I think it actually felt fun because we were doing it in sort of a small way, and we were enjoying it and making small bits of progress. Sometimes small bits of progress are all you need when you're doing something dramatically different. If I think about Squiggly, when we started Squiggly, it did feel dramatically different. It doesn't now. And so I think we feel less rebellious now than we did probably when we started. But just thinking about like, what are the communities? And in your organization, look for people who you think do this well. Try and spend time with them, try and learn from them, get some informal mentoring. Like, who are the people who you see, you're like, oh, they managed to change that process, or they managed to challenge in a way that seemed to really stick and seemed to be really helpful, and sort of try and look for like, well, what is it? Like, how do they manage to kind of create that clarity and cut through to do something different? I am just going to give you the link now to the long read, which I did organise myself and get ready. So if you can stay on for 2 seconds, here you go. Right. These HBR big ideas are really good, these big idea series. So a couple of years ago, they took really big ideas and then they did sort of deep dives, all very well researched. And so they're not just sort of someone going, oh, I've had an idea about rebel talent. Francesca's work is researched in loads of organizations globally. They are long reads, but they have divided them out really nicely. All of those are really good to spend time with, not just the kind of rebel talent, rebel ideas one. So hopefully some useful food for thought for you all for over the summer. I hope to see lots of you doing the Squiggly Career Sprint with us. Give me feedback, email me at any time. I'm sarah@amazingif.com. We will start again at the beginning of September, where I think our first podcast, we already know, is going to be on time to think. So thank you all for joining so far this year. Thank you for joining if it was your first time today. Little break and then we'll be back and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everybody.